Did you notice what just happened in Israel? That every major Western outlet is covering with the clinical detachment of people who do not want you to understand what it actually means? Because reports circulating through Israeli security intelligence networks and regional defense analysis circles are describing something that analysts who have spent decades studying Middle Eastern security architecture are calling the most significant public admission of defensive limitation in Israel's modern history. Not a battlefield setback, not a diplomatic failure, something more fundamental than either of those. A government, one of the most militarily sophisticated governments on the planet, a government whose entire national identity is built around the premise that it can and will protect every citizen within its borders, has reportedly communicated to millions of its own people a message that those people never expected to hear from the state, that was built specifically so they would never have to hear it. The message, according to sources tracking Israeli civil defense communications, is not phrased in those exact words. Governments never phrase these things in exact words, but the substance of what is being communicated through civil defense directives, shelter protocols, military spokesperson statements, and the specific language being used in emergency preparedness broadcasts is translating in the assessment of regional security analysts into exactly that meaning. The Iron Dome, the Arrow system, the David Sling, the layered defensive architecture that Israel has spent decades and billions constructing and that the world has watched intercept thousands of incoming projectile is being described by sources inside Israeli defense establishment circles as operating at or near the boundary of its capacity under current threat conditions. The question on everyone's mind in security circles right now is not whether Israel's defensive systems are still functioning. They are. The question is whether they are functioning at a level that can absorb the simultaneous multi-vector, multi-theater threat environment that has been building since Iran's decapitation, and the subsequent fragmentation of Iranian command and control has released proxy networks from the coordination constraints that previously made their actions somewhat predictable and therefore somewhat interceptable. Analysts are warning that the specific combination of threat vectors now active simultaneously from the north, from the east, from the south, from actors whose decision-making is no longer coordinated through a central command that could be deterred or negotiated with, represents a qualitatively different defensive challenge than anything Israel's layered system was originally engineered to handle at full simultaneous saturation. And the haunting question you need to carry into everything I am about to show you is this: if one of the world's most advanced military defense systems is communicating capacity limitations to its own civilian population, what does that tell you about the nature and scale of the threat it is currently facing, and what happens to every other security architecture in the region if Israel's holds but barely? Before we break down exactly what the Israeli defensive capacity communication means, what triggered it, and what it signals for the regional security environment and global stability, subscribe right now, because the mainstream coverage is describing symptoms and completely missing the systemic diagnosis. To understand why Israel's reported communication to its civilian population about defensive limitations carries the weight it does, you need to understand the specific threat environment that has developed since Iran's post-Khamenei fragmentation created a regional security situation that nobody inside the American or Israeli security establishment fully modeled in advance. The mood inside Israeli security and civilian preparedness circles right now is described by sources as something that has no comfortable Israeli precedent. Not the mood of 1973, when surprise attack created a crisis of military confidence that the system subsequently resolved through mobilization and counterattack. Not the mood of 2006, when Hezbollah's missile campaign strained northern Israeli civilian life but did not threaten the fundamental premise of state protective capacity. Something different. Something that sources describe as the mood of people who understand that the threat environment has changed in a structural way that tactical responses cannot fully address. The trigger is the specific consequence of Iran's leadership decapitation that was not fully modeled in advanced planning. When a centralized adversary with command and control architecture is removed, when the supreme leader is gone, when the senior Revolutionary Guard commanders are gone, when the coordination infrastructure that held the proxy network together is disrupted, the expected outcome in deterrence theory is that proxy activity decreases because the directing authority has been eliminated. What Israeli and American planners are reportedly discovering is that the actual outcome in this specific case has been the opposite. Without central coordination, Iran's proxy network has not demobilized, it has atomized. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi remnants in Yemen, Iraqi militia factions, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad cells, and smaller regional actors who were previously constrained by Iranian strategic coordination are now operating on their own initiative, on their own timelines, with their own target selection, and without the back-channel communication infrastructure that allowed Israeli intelligence to anticipate and prepare for coordinated attack sequences. The specific danger of atomized threat actors for a layered defensive system is the danger of simultaneous uncoordinated saturation. Iron Dome, Arrow, and David Sling were engineered and battle-tested against threats that, even when numerous, had a degree of coordination that made their timing, sequencing, and trajectory somewhat predictable to defensive systems. Uncoordinated simultaneous launches from multiple vectors by actors who are not communicating with each other produce a saturation pattern that is genuinely different from what the system was optimized to handle. The civil defense communication that sources are describing, the shelter directives, the emergency preparedness language, the specific framing of civilian protective protocols reflects the Israeli government's calculation that civilian preparation for a scenario in which not every incoming threat can be intercepted is now operationally necessary rather than theoretically precautionary. Here is where the dots connect into the picture that reveals why Israel's defensive capacity communication is the most significant regional security signal of this entire conflict period. The Iron Dome architecture has been the foundational premise of Israeli civilian security for over a decade. Its intercept rate against short-range rocket fire from Gaza has been documented at above 90% in most engagement periods. Arrow's performance against ballistic missiles has been similarly impressive. The system's success has been so consistent that it has created a specific kind of strategic confidence, not just in Israel, but in every American ally watching, that layered missile defense can reliably protect civilian populations against the kinds of threats that regional adversaries can generate. If Israel's government is communicating to its civilian population that this premise requires qualification, that there are scenarios in the current threat environment where the system's capacity may be insufficient to prevent all impact, the strategic confidence that has been foundational to Israeli deterrence posture for a decade is being publicly revised in real time. The leverage dimension of this admission operates in multiple directions simultaneously. For Hezbollah remnants and other proxy actors watching Israeli civil defense communications, a government acknowledgement of defensive limitations is the most valuable intelligence assessment they could receive, not because it tells them something they did not already know about their own capabilities, but because it tells them that their strategy of simultaneous multi-vector saturation is having the exact psychological and preparedness effect it was designed to produce. The betrayal dimension runs through the Israeli civilian population's relationship with the state's foundational protective promise. Israel was established on a specific promise that Jewish people would have a state that could and would protect them from the threats that statelessness had historically made them unable to resist. The Iron Dome was the technological embodiment of that promise in the modern threat environment. A government communication suggesting that promise has operational limitations is not just a civil defense directive. It is a revision of the foundational compact between the Israeli state and its citizens. The back-channel dimension involves the American military support architecture currently operating in the region. Sources suggest that conversations between Israeli defense officials and American military planners about defensive augmentation, additional Patriot batteries, increased interceptor resupply, possible direct American defensive engagement in specific scenarios have been operating at a level of urgency that reflects the Israeli assessment that current defensive capacity requires supplementation rather than simply continued operation. The institutional panic at the Israeli defense establishment level is described by sources as operating on a specific and novel track. Not panic about military capability. Israeli offensive capability remains formidable and operational. Panic about the specific scenario in which offensive capability is intact, but defensive capacity is strained, creating a situation where Israel can strike but cannot fully absorb the retaliatory response that striking produces. The strategic logic of offensive action depends on the confidence that defensive systems can manage the retaliation. When that confidence requires qualification, the strategic calculus of offensive options changes fundamentally. We are potentially looking at a regional security environment in which the deterrence architecture that has structured Middle Eastern stability for a decade is undergoing simultaneous stress testing on every axis: offensive capability versus defensive capacity, centralized adversary versus atomized proxy network, American support commitment versus American domestic political constraints, Israeli civilian morale versus the reality of a threat environment that no defensive system was fully engineered to absorb. Let us talk about what the next 6 months look like across the consequence tracks that matter most. Scenario 1, the defensive augmentation track. If American military planners respond to Israeli defensive capacity communications with substantial augmentation, additional interceptor systems, direct defensive engagement authorization, accelerated resupply of depleted interceptor stocks, the immediate consequence is a stabilization of Israeli defensive confidence that reduces the civilian communications strategic significance. The scenario requires American domestic political support for substantially increased direct military engagement in Israel's defense at a moment when the Iran war is already generating significant domestic political cost. For American consumers, the augmentation scenario means sustained military expenditure on top of the Iran operation's already significant cost. Defense budget supplementals, interceptor resupply contracts, additional deployment costs, all flowing through a federal budget that is simultaneously managing the $50 billion direct military cost of the Iran operation and the downstream economic consequences of Strait of Hormuz disruption. Your federal tax contribution to Middle Eastern security architecture is potentially looking at numbers that make the current $14 billion annual defense aid figure appear modest. Scenario 2, the civilian population displacement. The scenario that humanitarian analysts find most immediately consequential is the civilian population response to sustained defensive limitation communications. Reports suggest that demographic movement within Israel from northern and southern population centers toward central urban areas perceived as having better defensive coverage is already occurring at levels that are straining municipal infrastructure in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. If this movement continues and accelerates, the economic consequence for Israel's technology and financial sectors concentrated in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area is significant. Israel's technology sector represents approximately 50% of its export revenue. A civilian population concentrated in one geographic area for defensive reasons, operating under sustained threat conditions, with economic activity disrupted by shelter protocols and emergency preparedness requirements, is an economic stress scenario with global technology supply chain implications. Israeli technology companies supply critical components and systems to global manufacturers across defense, communications, cybersecurity, and semiconductor sectors. Scenario 3, the regional deterrence collapse. The scenario that security strategists find most consequential at the global level is the regional deterrence collapse that follows from a demonstrated reduction in Israeli defensive capacity. Every regional actor, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, the Gulf states, has calibrated its own security architecture around the premise that Israeli defensive capability sets a floor for what is achievable in the region. If that floor is revised downward, every regional security calculation updates simultaneously. Saudi Arabia's normalization trajectory with Israel, which was among the most significant potential regional stabilization developments of the decade, faces its most severe stress test if Israeli defensive capacity limitations become a sustained rather than temporary condition. The Abraham Accords architecture, already under pressure from the conflict's regional spillover, potentially faces a recalibration if the security premise underlying those agreements appears operationally qualified. Here is what I want you to carry with you after everything we have just walked through together. Israel's communication to its civilian population about defensive limitations is not a tactical battlefield update. It is a strategic signal sent simultaneously to its own citizens, to its American patron, to its regional adversaries, to its proxy threat actors, and to every government watching the regional security architecture undergo its most significant stress test in decades about the nature of the threat environment that has emerged from the specific consequences of the Iran decapitation operation. The signal says something that Western strategic planning did not fully anticipate. Removing a centralized adversary does not eliminate the threat network that adversary controlled. It releases that network from the coordination constraints that made it manageable, and a released atomized, uncoordinated threat network is in some specific and important ways more dangerous to a defensive architecture than a centralized one, because it cannot be deterred, cannot be negotiated with, cannot be predicted with the pattern recognition that defensive systems depend on, and cannot be eliminated through the targeted strikes that worked against centralized command structures. What Israel is communicating to its citizens is this: we built the most advanced defensive system the world has seen for the threat environment we faced. The threat environment has changed in ways that our system was not fully engineered to address and prepare accordingly. The haunting thought I want you to carry is this: the Iron Dome was supposed to be the answer. For a decade, it was the answer. Every incoming rocket, every ballistic missile, every precision-guided munition that it intercepted was proof that modern defensive technology could protect civilian populations from the consequences of regional conflict. That proof was foundational, not just for Israel, but for every American ally that has been told that American defensive technology and American security guarantees can protect them from whatever the threat environment produces. If Israel, with American support, with the most advanced layered defensive architecture ever fielded, with decades of operational experience and battle-tested systems, is communicating to its citizens that the current threat environment exceeds what that system can fully manage, the question every American ally is now asking is not about Israel. It is about themselves. It is about whether the security guarantees and defensive architectures they have been told will protect them are calibrated for the threat environment they actually face, or the threat environment that existed when those guarantees were made. That question does not have a comfortable answer right now, and the people who are supposed to provide that answer are the same people who are currently managing an Iran operation, whose strategic objectives are still being debated, whose economic costs are still being calculated, and whose downstream consequences, including this one, were not fully modeled before the decision that produced them was made. Stay sharp, keep watching, because what Israel is telling its citizens today is the regional security system telling everyone something about the world we are all living in.